There's a tendency to think that life-changing moments arrive with noise, big announcements, dramatic gestures, clear signals that something important is happening. But the moment I couldn't stop thinking about didn't arrive that way at all. It was quiet, almost insignificant on the surface, and that's precisely why it took me so long to understand its weight. Nothing objectively extraordinary happened. No cinematic backdrop, no decisive line of dialogue. Yet afterward, my mind kept returning to it, looping through the details with unusual persistence, and that repetition was the first clue. From a psychological standpoint, the mind doesn't fixate randomly. Attention is expensive. If something keeps pulling you back, it's usually because it's interacting with a deeper layer of your values or your identity. In other words, the moment wasn't important because of what happened. It was important because of what it revealed. What stood out most was a sense of internal alignment. For the first time, my thoughts weren't fragmented. There was no internal debate, no weighing of options, no subconscious resistance, just clarity, and clarity is rare. Most of our decisions are made under conditions of uncertainty, emotional noise, and competing incentives. This moment cut through all of that. It wasn't emotional chaos, it was cognitive coherence. Everything felt simpler. Not easier, but simpler. Philosophically, that matters. We often misunderstand love as intensity, when in reality, durability comes from consistency. Intensity spikes and fades. Consistency compounds. That moment didn't overwhelm me, it stabilized me. It suggested, quietly but convincingly, that this person fit into the long-term architecture of my life, not just the short-term experience of it. And that's where the thinking wouldn't stop. Because once your brain detects a pattern that aligns with your long-term trajectory, it keeps testing it. I replayed the moment not out of nostalgia, but out of verification. Was this real, or was it projection? Was I responding to who she actually was, or who I wanted her to be? Each time I examined it, the conclusion stayed the same. The signal didn't degrade under scrutiny. If anything, it strengthened. There's a concept in systems thinking. Robust systems perform well not only under ideal conditions, but under stress. When I thought about that moment during pressure, during doubt, distraction, or difficulty, it still held. That's when it crossed from being emotionally meaningful to being structurally important. It wasn't just a feeling, it was data. What's interesting is that the moment itself didn't tell me she would be my future wife. That realization came later. What the moment did was narrow the field. It eliminated noise. It created a constraint in my thinking. Any future that didn't include her now felt incomplete, less optimal. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. We like to believe we control our biggest realizations, but often they emerge from attention rather than intention. I wasn't searching for the one. I was paying attention to what my mind refused to let go of. That's a critical distinction. When you chase outcomes, you're biased. When you observe patterns, you're informed. And here's the part that matters most. Moments like this don't demand immediate action. They demand honesty. The danger isn't missing the moment. It's dismissing it because it doesn't arrive in the form you expect. Because it's inconvenient. Because it challenges your current trajectory. But the cost of ignoring a clear signal is almost always higher than the cost of responding to it. Looking back, I realized the moment didn't change my life instantly. It changed the direction of my thinking. And over time, that change in thinking altered my decisions. And those decisions, compounded, reshaped my future. So if there's a moment in your life that your mind keeps returning to, quiet, persistent, unresolved, don't rush to explain it away. Sit with it, test it, question it. Sometimes, the most important moments aren't the ones that shout for your attention, but the ones that calmly refuse to leave it. After that moment, the question wasn't whether I felt something different, it was why. Difference, after all, is easy to romanticize. But I wasn't interested in novelty or excitement. I wanted to understand the mechanism. What exactly made her stand apart from everyone else I had known? Psychologically, the answer wasn't chemistry in the traditional sense. Chemistry is reactive. It's about sparks and volatility. What I experienced was closer to resonance. When two systems resonate, they don't compete for energy, they amplify each other. Conversations didn't feel like performances. Silence didn't feel like absence. There was no need to manage impressions or optimize responses. That lack of self-monitoring is significant. It signals safety, and safety, not excitement, is what allows people to think clearly, grow, and build something durable. What also stood out was how she interacted with my curiosity. Most people respond to curiosity by either matching it superficially or shutting it down entirely. She did something else. She engaged it without trying to control it. She asked questions that didn't seek validation, and she listened without waiting to speak. That created a feedback loop of mutual respect. Ideas could evolve instead of being defended. In a world where most interactions are transactional, that felt fundamentally different. Philosophically, that difference points to alignment rather than attraction. Attraction pulls you towards someone. Alignment allows you to move forward with someone. With her, I didn't feel pulled off course. I felt oriented. My goals didn't shrink to make space for the relationship. And the relationship didn't demand priority at the expense of everything else. Instead, it integrated naturally into the broader system of my life. That integration is rare, and it's often misunderstood. We're taught to believe love requires sacrifice of self. In reality, the best form of partnership reduces internal friction. There was also an unusual balance between independence and connection. She didn't need constant reassurance, and she didn't create emotional dependency. That wasn't distance, it was stability. When two people are secure individually, connection becomes a choice rather than a requirement. And choice is where commitment gains meaning. You stay not because you have to, but because it's the most rational and fulfilling option available. Another key difference was how conflict existed, or rather, how it didn't escalate. Disagreement didn't trigger defensiveness. There was no immediate need to win. Instead, there was a shared assumption that understanding mattered more than dominance. That assumption changes everything. It transforms conflict from a threat into a tool. You stop protecting your ego and start refining the system. That's not romantic in the cinematic sense, but it's profoundly powerful in real life. I also noticed how she related to time. She wasn't rushing the future and she wasn't anchored to the past. There was a calm confidence in the present moment. That mindset is contagious. It slows you down in the best way. It encourages long-term thinking. And long-term thinking is the foundation of any meaningful commitment. When someone naturally operates on that time horizon, planning a future doesn't feel abstract. It feels practical. What ultimately made her different wasn't a single trait. It was coherence. Her values, actions, and intentions were aligned. There were no sharp contradictions to explain away, no persistent discomfort to rationalize. That coherence made trust almost inevitable. Trust isn't built through promises, it's built through predictability over time. With her, predictability didn't mean boredom, it meant reliability. And reliability is what allows ambition, creativity, and vulnerability to coexist. This is the part we often avoid acknowledging. Love isn't about finding someone who makes you feel more. It's about finding someone who makes you feel less divided. Less conflicted. Less defensive. Less distracted. With her, my mental energy wasn't consumed by uncertainty. It was freed for focus, for growth, for imagining a future that actually made sense. So when I say she felt different, I don't mean she stood out in a crowd. I mean she stood firm under examination. The more rigor I applied, the more stable the conclusion became. And that's how you know the difference isn't emotional noise. It's structural truth. If you want to know whether someone truly belongs in your future, don't ask how strongly you feel. Ask how clearly you think when they're around, and whether that clarity expands or contracts your sense of what's possible. Once you recognize a moment that matters, and once you understand why a person is fundamentally different, the next step is unavoidable. You're forced to update your model of what love and commitment actually mean, and that update is often uncomfortable because it contradicts many of the assumptions we've absorbed without questioning them. For a long time, I thought love was primarily an emotional state, something you fall into, something that happens to you. But that interpretation is incomplete. Emotions are volatile. They respond to context, stress, novelty. If love were only emotional, it would be unreliable by design. What that moment taught me is that love is less about how you feel in isolation and more about how you behave over time, especially when conditions are imperfect. From a psychological perspective, commitment is not the suppression of alternatives. It's the reduction of internal conflict. When you're truly aligned with someone, you don't feel trapped by commitment. You feel focused. The moment clarified that distinction. It didn't create pressure to choose. It removed the noise that made choosing difficult. That's a critical insight, because most people avoid commitment not out of fear of responsibility, but out of fear of misalignment. Philosophically, this reframes commitment as an act of agency rather than sacrifice. We tend to romanticize sacrifice, but sacrifice without purpose breeds resentment. Purpose-driven commitment, on the other hand, generates momentum. With her, commitment didn't feel like giving something up. It felt like investing energy where the return made sense. That's not idealism. That's rationality. Another lesson was about patience, not passive waiting, deliberate timing. The moment didn't demand immediacy. It demanded consistency. It taught me that rushing clarity is often a sign of insecurity, while allowing clarity to mature is a sign of confidence. Real commitment doesn't need urgency to validate itself. It survives quiet periods. It survives uncertainty. And that endurance is what distinguishes lasting bonds from temporary intensity. I also learned that love isn't about minimizing risk. It's about choosing which risks are worth taking. Avoiding risk entirely leads to isolation, not safety. The moment helped me see that emotional risk becomes manageable when shared with someone who treats it responsibly. Trust isn't blind optimism, it's a calculated belief based on observed behavior. And once that belief reaches a certain threshold, inaction becomes the greater risk. There's also an ethical dimension to commitment that we don't talk about enough. When you recognize genuine alignment and continue to treat the relationship as optional entertainment, you create asymmetry. You benefit from connection without offering stability. The moment forced me to confront that imbalance. Commitment, at its core, is an ethical response to clarity. When you see clearly, you're responsible for acting accordingly. What surprised me most was how commitment enhanced freedom rather than restricted it. By reducing relational ambiguity, it freed cognitive and emotional resources. Decisions became simpler. Priorities became clearer. Instead of constantly evaluating possibilities, I could direct attention toward building something real. That's the paradox. When you stop keeping every door open, you actually move faster through the one that matters. The moment also reshaped how I viewed permanence. Permanence isn't about certainty in the future. It's about intention in the present. You don't commit because you can guarantee outcomes. You commit because you're willing to engage fully with the process. That willingness is what transforms uncertainty from a threat into a shared challenge. Ultimately, what that moment taught me is that love isn't found. It's constructed, iteratively, through honest attention and deliberate choice. Feelings may initiate the process, but values sustain it, and commitment is the mechanism that turns potential into reality. So if you're waiting for love to feel perfectly safe before you commit, you'll wait indefinitely. Clarity doesn't arrive after commitment. It often arrives because of it. And the most meaningful progress in life begins the moment you decide to stop hedging and start building. Once commitment becomes clear, the future stops being an abstract idea and starts behaving like a design problem. Not a fantasy, not a vague hope, but a system you can actually reason about. When I think about a future with her, what stands out isn't perfection or certainty, it's coherence. The pieces fit together in a way that makes forward motion not only possible, but logical. The future I see isn't defined by specific milestones, it's defined by shared principles. Curiosity, integrity, long-term thinking. Those principles act like constraints in engineering. They limit randomness and increase reliability. Within those constraints, there's room for growth, experimentation, even failure. But there's less wasted energy, less friction. You're not constantly renegotiating fundamentals. You're building on them. Psychologically, imagining a future together revealed something important. Progress feels different when it's shared. Individual ambition is powerful, but it's also fragile. It's easy to burn out when every setback is carried alone. With her, effort feels distributed, not diluted, distributed. Challenges don't feel lighter because they disappear. They feel lighter because they're contextualized. There's a broader narrative that makes short-term difficulty tolerable. What I see in that future is not a static version of us, but an evolving one. Growth doesn't stop after commitment, it accelerates. But it accelerates in a direction that's mutually reinforcing. When one person improves, the system improves. That feedback loop is critical. Without it, growth creates distance. With it, growth creates depth. There's also a shared relationship to uncertainty. The future is unpredictable by definition. Anyone who promises otherwise is either naive or dishonest. But unpredictability isn't the same as instability. Stability comes from how you respond to change, not from avoiding it. With her, I see adaptability without panic, confidence without rigidity. That combination makes long-term planning realistic rather than naive. Another element of the future I see is accountability, not surveillance or control, but mutual responsibility. When your actions affect someone you respect deeply, your standards rise naturally. You don't optimize for short-term convenience. You optimize for long-term trust. That shift changes behavior at a fundamental level. It's not about being watched, it's about being aligned. Time also behaves differently in this future. It's no longer something to race against or escape from. It becomes something you invest in deliberately. Days aren't just consumed, they compound. Small habits matter more than grand gestures. Consistency outweighs intensity. That mindset doesn't just improve relationships, it improves life. Importantly, the future I imagine isn't insulated from hardship. There will be stress, disagreement, loss, and uncertainty. But those elements don't invalidate the vision, they test it. And a vision that can survive testing is worth committing to. What matters isn't avoiding difficulty, but choosing a context in which difficulty produces growth rather than damage. This is where many people get it wrong. They look for a future that guarantees happiness. That's impossible. Happiness isn't a stable state, it's a byproduct. The better question is whether the future you're building increases your capacity to respond well to reality. With her, the answer is yes. Not because everything will work out, but because whatever happens will be faced with clarity, respect, and shared purpose. When I think about growing older together, it's not about nostalgia or comfort, it's about continuity. The idea that the person beside you understands not only who you are now, but who you've been trying to become. That kind of understanding doesn't limit you, it anchors you. It gives change a reference point. Ultimately, the future I see is not a promise of ease. It's a commitment to meaning, to building something that justifies the effort it requires. And that's the most honest version of love there is, because in the end, the future isn't something you predict. It's something you construct. And the most important decision you make isn't what you build, but who you build it with.